I grew up in Beeville, Texas, a tiny place where Main Street has one blinking traffic light and folks spend their weekends at the local diner. When I was 19, my boyfriend Jack suggested we go for a drive late one summer night. It was him, me, and our two friends, Amy and Mike. We were restless in that way, only small, all-town teenagers can be, and wanted a bit of excitement before we all started our work shifts or went off to community college. We cruised through the empty streets, rolling down the windows to let the warm breeze in. The sound of cicadas had started to fade as we left the dim glow of downtown behind. After a while, Jack brought up an old cemetery he had heard about from his uncle, a graveyard from the 1800s, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. In our boredom, we all thought it was fun to check it out. The road leading there was little more than packed dirt, lined on both sides by dense brush and looming mesquite trees. Jack's car headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the further we drove, the quieter it seemed to get. I couldn't even hear the faint chirp of crickets. My stomach nodded, but I kept telling myself this was just another small-town myth, a quirky nighttime adventure. Eventually, the gate to the cemetery came into view. It was a dragging, rusted structure, and when we got out of the car, its hinges let out a low groan. The ground was coated in a light layer of fog, unusual for our part of Texas in mid-July, yet there it was, clinging to the old tombstones. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end, but I forced a laugh to keep everyone's spirits up. We took a few tentative steps through crooked rows of headstones. They were worn by decades of weather, their engravings barely readable. Now and then, I glanced behind me at the gate to make sure our path back was clear. Mike joked about us being grave robbers, but his voice sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself that everything was fine. Out of nowhere, Amy stopped. She pointed to the far corner of the cemetery without a word. At first, I saw nothing but swirling mist. Then I noticed movement. Slow, 4 figures in white robes emerged, lit just enough by the moon to make out their shapes. They stood in a circle around one particular grave, each moving in a uniform pattern, as if performing some silent ritual. My breathing grew shallow, and I could feel my pulse hammering. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Who were they? Why this old cemetery? And why in the dead of night? I didn't dare speak. None of us did. After a few paralyzed seconds, Jack took a step back, tugging at my sleeve. He mouthed, "Let's go." Amy and Mike nodded. No one argued. We turned, careful not to make any noise on gravel path. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain those hooded figures would hear it. Reaching the car was a blur. Jack fumbled with the keys, dropped them once, and then finally got the engine started. The headlights washed over those distant shapes for a split second, and I'm almost certain one of them turned to look in our direction. I caught a glimpse of a pale face, but the memory of it feels incomplete, like my mind won't let me recall every detail. Jack hit the gas and the car shot forward, kicking up gravel behind us. For what felt like an eternity, none of us spoke. I kept looking out the rear window, expecting to see someone trailing us, but it was just darkness. My thoughts jumped from relief to fear to adrenaline, unable to settle. By the time we reached the relative comfort of a well-lit street, our nerves were frayed. We parked by an old convenience store, the only place open at that hour, but nobody had the energy to go inside. We just sat there, trying to steady breathing. Amy was the first to break the silence, asking if anyone had a clue what we had just witnessed. Mike refused even to guess. Jack's hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly, I could see his knuckles turning white. We finally agreed we wanted no part of whatever was happening in that cemetery. It felt safer to let it remain unexplained. I recall sitting in that passenger seat, my eyes fixed on the fluorescent glow of the store sign, feeling like the world had tilted in a small but unnerving way. None of us ever returned to that graveyard. Sometimes the story surfaces when we get together, usually brought up in a hushed voice, as though speaking too loudly might sermon those cloaked figures. We still speculate. Were they members of some secret group, or was it just a twisted prank? All I know is that on a warm Texas night, we stumbled upon something we were never meant to see. And in that brief, haunting moment, our ordinary small-town life felt like it had veered into a place where it did not belong. I was driving along US Highway 59 in Texas with my two kids, Elena and Mateo, late one summer night. We had just left my friend Carlos's place in Wharton, planning to head back home to Victoria before it got too dark. The children had been bickering in the back seat for most of the ride, complaining about who had more room or whose turn it was to hold the tablet. My patience was stretched thin. Pulling over to the shoulder seemed like the only way to regain control of the situation. I turned on my hazard lights, put the car in park, and stepped out to talk to them face to face. "Listen," I said, leaning into the back seat, "I need you both to calm down. It's late, and I can't focus when you fight." They quieted down, though they still glared at each other. I could see exhaustion on their faces, and I felt guilty for not getting them home sooner. Just as I was about to get back in, I noticed a car creeping up behind us. It stopped parallel to my driver's window, and I saw a middle-aged couple rolling down their window. The man who had a bit of stub on his chin called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" I explained that I was just pulling over to manage my kids. The woman in the passenger seat smiled and said, "Oh, that's good to hear. We just wanted you to know there's a big wreck over the next hill and traffic's backed up. You'd save yourself a lot of trouble if you took a side road a mile back." She pointed behind them, then wished me luck and drove on. I looked up at the night sky, wondering if I really wanted to follow a detour I knew nothing about. With two tired children in the car, the idea of getting lost on an unfamiliar road after dark made me uneasy. Deciding that sitting in traffic would be preferable to being stranded on a strange detour, I continued on the main route. It wasn't long before I reached the rise they had mentioned. To my confusion, the road ahead was clear. No evidence of a collision, no brake lights, and no emergency vehicles, just open asphalt. As I started down the other side of the hill, something on my right caught my eye. I glanced over and recognized the same car that had warned me about the wreck. It was parked on a dirt path just off a small turnoff. The couple stood outside facing the tree line. They were completely still, as though transfixed by something deeper in the woods. A prickly sensation spread along my arms, and I found myself pressing the gas pedal a bit harder. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had engine trouble. Perhaps they were stretching their legs, but it was unsettling to see them there, motionless in the middle of nowhere. The moment I cleared the bend in the road, I lost sight of them. My children, thankfully, had drifted off, so the rest of the drive was spent in silence, my thoughts swirling with questions. When I got home, I tucked Elena and Mateo into bed, trying not to dwell on the incident. Yet I felt unable to shake off a gnawing sense of unease. The next day, I still had errands to run in the same area, so I found myself retracing the same road in broad daylight. As I neared the turnoff, my pulse quickened at the memory. Slowing down, I finally got a proper look at the side road. A bright yellow sign, only visible if you drove a few yards in, read "Dead End." It made no sense. Why would that couple insist I take a shortcut that led to nowhere? And why were they standing there in the dark with no apparent destination? For all the time I've spent on Texas highways, I've rarely been so unnerved. There was nothing obviously sinister about them, but the entire exchange felt wrong in ways I can't fully explain. I often wonder what I would have found if I had gone down that narrow road, trusting strangers' directions over my own better judgment. It reminds me to stay cautious when traveling those quiet, because I have no idea what might have happened or what that couple really intended. Sometimes a road that seems lonely is safest. A detour from an overly friendly stranger might lead to someplace you never wanted to be. I remember the date perfectly, August 22nd, 2022. I was driving along Highway 26 in Oregon, heading back to campus for the start of my fall semester the next morning. My evening lecture was set for 8:00 a.m., and I had underestimated the time it would take to return from a weekend visit with my relatives in Bend. The highway stretched endlessly, the darkness broken only by my headlights and the faint glow of a waning moon. My music had faded into static hours ago, so the engine's hum was my only companion. I glanced at my fuel gauge and realized it had dipped dangerously close to empty. I knew I should have filled up sooner, but I had been rushing to make good time. My heart sank when the car started to sputter. One moment, the engine was humming. The next, it made a choking sound and died. I managed to ease the car to the shoulder. Repeated attempts to restart it failed. and I felt a surge of frustration and anxiety creep in. Pulling out my phone, I found no service. There were no bars, no roaming, nothing. It was just me, the silent highway, and a stand of dark trees on both sides. I locked the car doors on instinct. Something about the emptiness of the night felt unsettling, though I tried to reassure myself I was safe, just stuck, but safe. I decided to wait, hoping a passing vehicle or a restored phone signal would offer some help. Seconds turned into minutes, and the quiet outside the windshield pressed in on me. Occasionally, the wind rustled through the trees, but it was otherwise silent. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through old texts and photos on my phone, but the battery was low, so I quickly gave up. Movement on the edge of my peripheral vision caught my attention. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal. Instead, a tall, thin man appeared from the tree line, stepping carefully onto the roadside gravel. He wore grimy clothes and had scruffy hair as though he had been out here for weeks. I could see his face faintly in the sunlight. There was a restlessness in his expression that made me uneasy. Without warning, he approached my window. He leaned in, cupping his hands against the glass. I hesitated, unsure of his intentions. Then he knocked. It was a calm tap at first, but when I did not respond, it grew more insistent. He said something, but my windows were up, and I only caught fragments of his voice. I thought I heard him introduce himself as Harvey, repeating that he needed help. My pulse raced, yet I tried to remain composed. Rolling down the window even an inch felt like a risk. Something about his frantic eyes told me this was not just a traveler in need of a ride. He began knocking harder, his pleas more urgent, though I could not make out every word. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I kept my gaze straight ahead, praying a car would appear. At last, I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. Relief washed through me. As the vehicle drew closer, I realized it was a police cruiser, perhaps the only car on the road for miles at that hour. Its lights illuminated my dead car and the figure outside. When the cruiser stopped, 2 officers stepped out, flashlights in hand. The stranger backed away, his posture tense as if he was about to bolt. The first officer shone a beam into my window. I unlocked the door and explained my situation. Out of gas, my phone out of range, and a man claimed Harvey persistently knocking on my window. The officer listened carefully, then turned his flashlight on the tall man who remained a short distance away. "Sir," the officer called, "what are you doing out here?" Harvey's eyes shifted between the officers and me. He mumbled something about being lost, but did not provide details. Without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees. The officers seemed more concerned with my safety than chasing him, especially given the hour. They offered me a ride to the nearest town, about 20 miles down the highway, and called for a tow truck on their radio. I gratefully accepted. The moment I settled into the back of the cruiser, I glanced over my shoulder at the dense line of trees. Harvey was gone, the branches swaying as if he had never been there. I spent the ride contemplating how close I might have come to real danger. I could not shake the feeling that something was deeply off about him, his urgency to explain himself, and the way he vanished when the authorities showed up. The police dropped me at a small gas station where I waited for the tow truck, my mind still replaying those knocks on the glass.